Hello, and welcome to Proving Contraries. I'm your host, John Young, and today I have a very special guest, Jeff Thayne. Jeff, you wrote a book which I have read. I bought this a couple of years ago. It's called Who is Truth? I think I bought this in part because I like the little equations down at the bottom. I uh, I majored in computer engineering, which is not the same thing as physics, but we took the elementary physics courses, and I really enjoyed physics. And the great ideas of physics just really, I don't know, it really has an impact on my mind. It inspires me to think that we as human beings can come to a better knowledge of reality through these big ideas. But one of the things I got out of your book was that maybe these big ideas, like the kind we get in our physics class, aren't the way to think about life, or religion in general. And they might be able to lead us astray to some extent. It, would you echo that kind of a short purpose of your book?
You want me to describe the purpose of the book? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So, honestly, the the book was actually many years in the writing. It actually grew out of some thinking that we were doing in psychology. We're trying to explore, for example, what a Greek versus Hebrew perspective on psychology might look like, and then out of that, we fleshed out some ideas that kind of took a tangent off of that project. But really, I just had a number of friends who started questioning and engaging in adversarial conversations surrounding the church and its doctrines and its teachings. And almost every time it's because many times, I'm not gonna say, I don't want to speak too universally here, but many times it was because they had sort of elevated a particular understanding of what the gospel is to some sort of abstract absolute, so that anytime they heard or read something that contradicted it, they just became dismissive and adversarial. Um, and the word that came to my mind at the time was ideolatry. They were kind of worshiping ideology, for example. And I'll
Mm-hmm.
just give you one example, like just where the rubber meets the road. I was a libertarian for a while. Well, I kind of still am in many ways. I have libertarian sensibilities and so on, right? But a lot of
Right.
my
Yeah.
friends, yeah, but a lot of my friends started to elevate the ideas of their libertarian worldview to this to this level of absolute bedrock truth. And anytime, for example, the church expressed policy preferences or priorities that didn't quite align with their libertarian worldview, then their assumption was that church leaders were somehow departing from the true gospel in some way. So that was just one example of many. I found the same thing from conservatives. I found the same thing from progressives and liberals and all across the political spectrum. They would have their particular ideology, whatever it was, and they would just treat that as so given and unquestionable that they started to measure everything they received from church leaders and even scripture against those absolutes. And it struck me as a very inflexible way of viewing the world, very inflexible way of um, inflexible is not quite the word. Well, yeah, it is the right word. I would say this, you know, but it was the opposite of humility, really, is what I'm going for.
Yes. Yes.
Right? This assumption, like I always grew up assuming that I could get it wrong, and that we need prophets and teachers and revelation to correct our own misunderstandings. And what I saw among many was this resistance to any form of divine correction. And so that's part of where the motivation for writing the book came from. That's just one piece of it, of course. But that's where I started spinning it off into a separate project.
Gotcha. And I think one of the roots of the problem, at least in Western culture, comes from the philosophies that we're often taught. When we go to college, we learn about, Locke and Aristotle and Plato. Can you explain what it is about maybe these philosophies that may be leading us in the wrong direction?
Yeah, so I want to be careful because in some ways, they do lead us in the right direction, right?
Hmm.
So that I don't think that they're universally bad by any means. Um, one of the things I address in the book is the assumption that we have largely inherited from the Greek intellectual tradition, the philosophical tradition, that says that truth, the ultimate bedrock reality, can never change. And and the idea here that if for example if the acceleration of, let's just use physics as an example like you were talking about before, right? Let's use acceleration of gravity is different on Mars than is on Earth. There must be some larger principle over above them both that is unchanging to account for that change. And many have taken that same assumption into our moral philosophy, right? And that if action A is right in this context and action B is right in that context, there must be some larger principle that is right in all contexts, and so on. And the quest for truth is therefore understood to be the quest for these abstract, unchanging principles. And because physical things change, like this book, for example, right? I could bend it, I could tear it, I could burn it, I could, soak it in water, it could exist, it could not exist. Since physical things change, we assume, therefore, that truth and the bedrock reality that we're searching for must be some sort of abstraction, non-physical abstraction, if it is to be this unchangeable ideal that at the end of our quest for ultimate truth. Um, and honestly, though, like this is a kind of something that you've alluded to before. When it comes to physics, that's actually great. Like that's actually a great way to look at things. Like we're looking for these universal constants and these universal laws, and it's been quite a fruitful endeavor. And in many moral endeavors, I mean, you can boil the things down to abstract principles. It works sometimes, right? I teach an ethics class where we talk about, informed consent and respect for persons and fulfilling our like fidelity to our responsibilities to those who we serve and so on. And these are principles that can accommodate many varying contexts, and they're true in all the contexts. There's no context, I think, where you shouldn't be faithful to your responsibilities to those around you. So like on one level, these sort of abstractions are useful. And
Hmm.
the problem is when you treat them rather than as useful constructs for navigating the world, and you start to treat those abstractions themselves, as though they were God, I guess. Right?
Okay, yeah, yeah. Just something that just came to mind was when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest law? And he said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and the other one is like it, to love your fellow man as yourself. And it seems to me that when we talk about moral things, like, is it the right thing to do to, you know, take care of my neighbor's weeds, or
Yeah,
mow their
I mean, yeah,
lawn,
right?
right? Those two principles don't really tell you what to do.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? It's like the more abstract you are, the less particular you get.
Yeah. The more abstract the moral principle, the less helpful it is in the weeds of life. Going back to their weeds
Yeah,
analogy, right?
exactly.
Yeah. Like like love the Lord, love others, right? But uh what do I do about my kids? What do I do about my marriage? What do I do about my neighbors? What do I do about my students? And what we teach is that we should be constantly seeking the guidance of the Holy Spirit to give us specific guidance in the particulars, and also that we should be making choices of our own accord in those particulars. And could it be, for example, that one course of action with respect to my students might be right, and another course of action might also be right? That there is not necessarily some sort of universal principle that dictates what's right in every particular, you know, possible situation we find ourselves in. That there might be many right things to do. Um, And so maybe we can't boil down right and wrong down to some sort of mathematical principle like we might with the law of gravity, right? With the law of gravity, We can predict exactly what the acceleration constant is going to be on Mars and Earth and the Moon and Pluto and and we can anticipate in advance of all these particular contexts what we're going to experience and what we're going to see and observe. And maybe with morality, it's actually a lot harder to anticipate in advance what the right thing to do is. Maybe sometimes we need that moment-to-moment guidance from an actual divine person that we can't get from an abstraction.
Right. And so maybe elaborate a little bit on, what you mean by you contrast in the book idea truth, which
Yes.
should be like the law of gravity.
Mhm.
And we can perhaps apply that incorrectly to, moral situations and person truth. Um, what is person truth like? I think usually I don't rationally think of person truth very often, but explain it to me and to our listeners what that means.
Well, to do that, I want to actually explain idea truth first, just because it's best understood in contrast, right? So
Okay.
idea truth, like the law of gravity, idea truth is abstract, right? So it's not physical. It's found in the ethereal world of ideas, right? You can never actually lay eyes on it. You can never actually touch it or smell it or taste it. The law of gravity doesn't exist anywhere. It exists everywhere and nowhere at all, which sounds familiar. That's what some people see God as, right? Yet everywhere, yet nowhere. Then he has no locality. Um, that's an example of idea truth. Whereas person truth is concrete, right? And to be clear here, when we talk about person truth, we're talking about Christ.
Okay.
Christ said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And the whole book is an intellectual experiment. What happens if we take that statement literally? What does it mean for Christ to be truth? Well, Christ is concrete. He was born, he died, he lived, he rose again. You can, if he were here, you could eat and drink with him. You could feel the prints and the nails in his hands. You could, you know, like you could talk with him as a man speaketh with his friends. Like he has a presence and he has physicality and form. Like he's concrete in a way that an abstract idea is not. Therefore, he can be present in a way that an abstract idea cannot be present. Furthermore, idea truth is like universal, right? Again, it exists everywhere. It's the same everywhere you go. Where And that means that, for example, if you understand morality in the idea through the lens of idea truth, if it's right for me, it's right for you. If it's right over there, it's right over there, and it's right everywhere. But whereas person truth can be deeply contextual in a way that you can't really do through the systematic articulation of principles down from the abstraction into the weeds, right? It could be, for example, that what Joseph Smith taught. And I mean, this is a little bit of a scary thing to say, but he said that which is wrong under one circumstances may be and often is right under another. Um,
Yeah, I was just thinking that this is a
yeah.
scary thing that you're talking about. Uh,
Well, I mean, like for example, one of the things that if you embrace idea truth, you might assume that let's say you're an ecclesiastical leader and you're addressing
mhm.
a member of your ward who has committed some sort of sin that might warrant church discipline. And if you embrace this abstract understanding of truth, you might assume that if this fellowshipment is right for this person who committed this sin, it's also right for that person who committed the exact same sin under very similar or identical circumstances. But for person truth, maybe not. Maybe this fellowshipment is right over here and excommunication is right over there. Or maybe nothing at all. Maybe a slap on the wrist and don't do it again. Go thy way and sin no more. Right? But the idea is
Right.
um, that there might be in the trenches guidance that you might receive from God that varies from context to context, always as an expression of God's will, always an expression of God's love, but not always identical from person to person, from context to context.
Right, because I think this idea that they call like bishop roulette, I don't like
Yes,
that term much.
I don't
I
either.
just don't like it. It it seems to a lot of us that even if Jesus Christ were, whispering the ear of all of our bishops, he would always say the same thing. And so I think that's why it's kind of hard to accept this idea that, I might talk to a friend who had the same issue growing up, and our bishops had different responses to both of us.
Mhm.
One person might take it as unfair. It's like, how would help somebody in that situation?
I mean, that's a pastoral question that I wish I had the full answer to, but what like my what I might do is ask them to acknowledge their assumptions. So you assume, for example, that this is like some sort of court hearing where if I shoplift,
Hmm.
$500 worth of goods, I should get 3 months of jail. And if someone else shoplifts $500 of goods, he should get 3 months of jail. And if not, then it's, but like I'm like what like who are you even thinking about right there? Right? This like my kids do this all the time, right? They have a really strong sense of fairness. And
Yes, yes.
if one person gets off for the same crime as the other person gets,
Hmm.
uh, punished for, some deep wrong has been done to them. And one thing I want to say, like, who are you thinking about right now? Like this is just not how life works, right? Yes, fairness generally is a good thing. We is a principle that we should all strive to be. But my daughter Penny is a different person than my son Forrest, with different needs and different contexts and different, and I'm trying to follow the spirit, and the spirit might tell me be gentle on Penny, and my spirit might tell me hold Forrest accountable. Am I not to do God's will? But yeah, and so like just look at it through the lens of parenting rather than through the lens of some kind of criminal justice system, for example.
Hmm.
Parents have to treat their kids sometimes a little bit differently because they're different people. And furthermore, just addressing the assumption again that are we worshiping some sort of abstract ideal of fairness, or are we worshiping God? And is God capable of giving slightly different instructions in different contexts? And historically, the answer to that is yes. Um,
Right. Yeah. We're studying the Old Testament this year, and I think that's pretty clear that you know what what God teaches us changes over time. Um,
and like
yeah.
and just one example of that, right? Like I think that
Hmm.
there are sociological needs that God was serving with polygamy that did not live this usefulness, and now it's not okay anymore.
Yeah.
And like idea truth has a harder like people who embrace the idea of real truth where idea is this universal abstraction. They've been end up doing a lot of sort of moral mathematics trying to make it all make sense to them, whereas if you understand God to be a living breathing person, who a parent who is addressing us in different contexts, you don't even need any of that moral mathematics to make sense of it. Like you don't feel this itch to make it some part of some larger abstract system anymore, right? Under
Right.
exactly what conditions is polygamy okay? You don't have to figure that out. You don't have to parse it out. Um, Another example here is that idea truth is unchangeable. And what we mean by this is like the law of gravity will never change across time. It's the same as it was a million years ago. It will be the same in a million years, presumably. Um, and many Christians place the same assumption on God that he is impassible, that God can never change his mind on anything, for example, that he can never be impacted by our prayers or feelings. Like this is some people argue against petitionary prayer for this very reason. And
Mm.
whereas idea truth is a person, and a person is a moral agent. And the example I often use for this is God loves you, and that love is never going to change. But could he do otherwise? Well, if you found out that your spouse couldn't help but love you because of some microchip in their brain that compelled them to do so, would it be particularly meaningful if the fact that she did love you? Would that be meaningful at all? And I think the answer is not really. Like if they couldn't help it,
Yeah.
and
It seems too mechanical and too ordered, or yeah.
yeah. But the fact of the matter is, the fact that God could choose otherwise is precisely what makes his faithfulness to us and his love for us so meaningful. He's a moral agent. Another example, I think yeah, that might be the last one. Let's see
Hmm.
here. Oh no, God, idea truth is passive, right? the law of gravity just waits out there, waiting for us to discover it. And if we don't do nothing, it will just wait there forever. Whereas person truth is active, right? Like he can come to us. Like you could be going your merry way and suddenly, boom, an angel. Saul can be like, I'm going to go persecute the church, and boom, no, you're not. Right? And same with Alma the Younger, and same with a whole bunch of like Joseph Smith, right? God can come to you, and he
Yeah.
can interrupt your endeavors. He can interrupt your ongoing projects of life and say, I have a different plan for you. The law of gravity will never do that. The laws of thermodynamics will never do that. Kant's categorical imperative will never do that. But God will. And then the last one here is idea truth can be discovered, meaning that you could do a bunch of experiments and figure out the law of gravity, but no amount of experiments on Earth can force God to show himself if he doesn't want to be seen.
I think for a lot of us, we wish he had shown himself more often.
Oh, I agree. I agree. But this is like Bruce R. McConkie said,
Yeah,
God is, well, how did he say it? The God of, he stands revealed or stands forever unknown. I don't remember the exact verbiage, right?
that sounds about right.
Yeah, but like person truth is somebody who reveals himself to you, and that part of that moral agency, right? If he wants to wait, he's going to wait, and there's nothing you can do to force him.
Yeah,
So
so I guess the way I've been trying to understand the idea of person truth, if Jesus Christ is person truth, we know he works through prophets, apostles, all the
yeah.
way on down to state presidents and bishops and parents like you and I. But yet yeah, I know, like, for example, myself as a parent, as someone who's worked various callings in the church, there's a learning process that we go through, and we can sometimes look back and say, oh, we made some mistakes, or
Mhm. Yes.
we changed the way we interact with our children, seeing that previous interactions weren't working in the way we expected them to. Um, how does I guess I when I think of things can change with God, to what extent are these changes based on just the fact he's working with us human beings who are at different places and at different times in our growth? Like he's accommodating where we're
Yeah.
at.
Um, like I don't want anybody to mistake me here. Like I don't think that God is, for example, is growing in the same way that we are, right? I don't think, for
Hmm.
example, I changed as a parent because I've become more humble and more patient with my kids over the years, or at least I think I'm trying to, right? But
Yeah.
um, I don't think that like, well, God was less patient in the Old Testament times, but he's more patient now because he's matured. I'm not trying to say anything like that, right? But what I would argue
Yes.
is that we have changed and the sociological needs of his children have changed. And and furthermore, I do believe that God is passive. I do believe that passive in the sense passable, meaning that he can be affected by us, right?
Hmm.
Like I think that is very possible. Like Christ, when he visited Jesus, when he visited the ancient Americans, he was moved by their prayers, and if I understand it right, changed his plans a little bit. Did I get that right? I don't remember. But like I remember you talking to them, and he was moved by their prayers. I was going to leave, but I'm going to stay a little longer, and
Hmm.
um, and so like I think that God is someone that we can appeal to, and it also means, for example, that yeah, we can expect the shape, texture, and specific imperatives of revealed truth to have a slightly different texture over time. We're not under all the same
It's good.
proscriptions
Yeah.
and as the ancient Israelites were. Like we eat pork, they didn't. Is that right? Yeah. Anyways, uh, and
Well,
we don't. Yeah,
yeah.
we're not even under the same necessary and the same prescriptions as the early Latter-day Saints were necessarily on some things. Now there are some things that are stable and enduring, like the law of chastity. But even what that looks like might change because polygamy right now would be a violation of chastity when it wasn't when Brigham Young was what profited the church. Um, so again, there are things that are enduring, stable patterns that I don't expect to change. I think that if they did change, they would, for example, violate the spirit of Like there needs to be some sort of continuity going on here. But I have friends who struggle with the fact that sometimes the details differ. And that doesn't bother me at all, precisely because I don't take the moral imperatives of the restored gospel to be some sort of universal abstraction in the same way as the law of gravity. I think all of God's commandments are to some degree contextual, even as some are more so than others. So, does that make sense?
I think so, and I can hear some people, say, thinking the question if they, they may not ask it, but a lot of people may be thinking of this is that, well, if it is changeable, it's like it feels like you're opening the door to things that
Yes.
maybe we would intuitively find very difficult to accept, right?
Yes.
And you can probably name a number of controversial issues in the church today, right?
Same-sex marriage, we'll name one right there, right?
Yeah, yeah,
For me, I'm squarely in the camp that I don't expect that to ever change.
yeah,
Right? I don't. I think that's one of those stable commandments that I have never seen any sort of, like the biological complementarity of the gender sexes and with respect to chastity seems like it has always been imperative that we respect that in God's eyes and God's law, that his plan for us involves the formation of families with that biological complementarity. I don't think there's anything that we should doubt or question there. And so there's always that tension, that tug of war there, right? But if
hmm
indeed that we treat the teachings and precepts of the gospel as like if God is at the pinnacle and not this abstract truth, does that mean that everything's up in the air? I don't think so. I mean, like I guess in the abstract, I can admit that sure, God could speak through his prophets and change even the things that I think are unchangeable and sacred. That is theoretically possible, just incredibly unlikely.
yeah,
You know, the challenge here is when people want these things to change and therefore are looking for the philosophical rationale to justify agitating for change and for I guess their reluctance to accept what is on offer from God here and now. And
right.
I look at that and I think in some ways that's the same mistake. Because in some ways they're saying, look, I don't think that what we have now is perfect. I think that what we have in the future might be more perfect. Therefore, I'm not going to accept what God has given me now in pursuit of this more perfect abstract ideal down the road. And I think that what they're doing in that scenario is a form of infidelity to the God who has revealed himself in the moment. So,
Okay, very nice. I like that. In the book, you do some reframing exercises where you have some idea truth questions, and those questions are, I guess, reframed as person truth questions. And I pulled three of them from the book to give listeners a taste of what they might expect reading your book. So I'd like to show these three and just ask
yeah,
some
sure.
questions about them. Uh, I'm assuming that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so this first one, um, idea truth. How can I really know for certain that the doctrinal principles and teachings of the church are true?
That's a very
Now
idea
you,
truth question, right? How can I
yeah,
how can I know that these abstract principles that up there in the sky are really the final, the final deal?
right. So I guess one question I had about this is like, well, I don't want to question the definition of every term, but when I think of certain,
Yeah.
and know, I think of somebody bearing their testimony, right? They say, I know the church is true. Now, true, no, maybe those things are slightly different from everybody, for everyone. What are you trying to really point out here? I would assume if somebody's like a child gets up and says, "I know the church is true," you're not really attacking that position here, are you?
I'm not. Yeah, no, I'm not attacking that position. Um, what I would say here, first off, is that there's two versions of no, and we use them
Hmm.
interchangeably. In other language, some other languages, they're different. Like for example, in Spanish, it's saber. I know that fact. Like, and then there's conocer, which is I know that person. And we say like I know the law of gravity versus I know my parents. We don't mean that in the same way. When I say I know my parents, does that mean
Okay.
that I've memorized my parents? That I've grasped the intellectual beauty of my parents and all their, the truth is people and people are inexhaustible. There's no way to fully um, know and plumb the depths of everything that there is to know about a person. What makes them people is the fact that they are infinities. I can go into Emmanuel Levinas and a whole bunch of other uh, philosophy stuff, but whatever. Like the point is that people are inexhaustible. You can never know them in the same way that you know a series of facts. Um, and so when I say that I know, like when people say they know the church is true, I think that's great. I'm not attacking that. I think ultimately the goal is not to know the church is true as much as it is to know God and to know God through the church and to know that the church is God's church. Because
Right.
to
And
say
I
I know the
honestly
church is,
didn't think,
yeah,
honestly, I didn't think you were attacking that, but that's,
yeah. But to be clear here, you know what? I think there's probably some doctrinal points that maybe we have gotten wrong. I don't know, right?
yeah.
To say I know the church is true, does that mean that everything in our current gospel principles manual is pitch perfect accurate? I have no idea. But what I do know is that this church bears God's signature, right? That this is
Right.
his authorized conduit through for administering the ordinances of salvation. Um, and so the point here again is the knowledge is first off a relational knowledge. Like I have come to know God through the teachings of the church, through the teachings of prophets and apostles, through the scriptures published by the church, through the ordinances of the gospel, through the temple. It's a personal knowledge I've come through God. And true, I mean, I'm not talking again abstract principles so much. I can't label every single thing in the gospel principles manual true or false. I have no idea. But what I can say is again, true in the sense that this is the real deal.
I like that very much. And to be honest, as I've gotten older, I've kind of come to see things similarly. I still give a testimony several times a year, and I'll say, I know this or I know that. And yeah, the no doesn't mean I'm just like so certain in a principle or a teaching. It's really more, in the, I guess it's what we're trying to do as a church. It's the direction we're going in. It's the experience I have with the people
The way we're
in,
forming covenant relations with and covenant connections with God, you know.
yes, and the covenant with my wife, my family, all those things I think are more true to me, than any knowledge of, can we just to pull something out of the air, if I go to the celestial kingdom, can I work my way up out of it?
Was Jonah really swallowed by
Okay,
a fish, or was this a metaphor written but a midrash from later on, or like like
right.
like like is every specific person named in the Old Testament real and historical character? I mean, I have no idea. But we don't
Yeah,
need to know all that stuff, right? We don't need to know um uh we gaining a testimony of the restored gospel does not require us to gain a testimony again of everything written by living prophets, or what it requires us is again that witness that this is the conduit through which we find connection with God and covenant with him and find salvation.
absolutely. So the person truth reframe for this is, how can I come to know God through the ordinances and community of the church? Which is essentially what we're just talking about. But I did have one concern about this, the community of the church. I think sometimes we talk somewhat negatively about church culture.
Yes.
And so I kind of wondered, well, could church culture sometimes lead us astray on the person truth? path?
Sometimes, sure, but also like even in all of its imperfections, sometimes it leads us to Christ, right? We sometimes we spend a lot of time complaining about our church culture. And I know you've
Hmm.
heard it, I've heard it, but the truth is we've got a good thing going here. I don't know. Like
Right.
I live in Rexburg. Rexburg is not perfect by any means, but I could knock on any door in my neighborhood and there's good, decent people. And if I need help, any one of them would drop their hat and help me in a heartbeat. Like that's great, right? A lot of people talk about the judgmentalism and so on within the church. And you know what?
Hmm.
Like I think judgmentalism is a problem, sure. Like, but the truth is, the fact that we have strong norms of righteous living, that's a blessing. That's great, right? The fact that, for
Right.
example, like that serves as a protection for our youth in so many ways, right? Like students come here to BYU Idaho, and they are protected from many of the social pressures towards sex and alcohol and drugs and all sorts of stuff. And like if that comes at a cost of sometimes a little bit of a stink eye, from if you find out that your friend is behaving wrong, well, we shouldn't be self-righteous. We should try to put it into that. But ultimately, the strong norms that we have are generally good. And I think that we don't fully acknowledge or realize all of that good because many of us don't necessarily recognize what it's like not to have it. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. I think sometimes we try to put, gospel truth on one hand, on the other hand, we have church culture. But part of the understanding what's really true and right is looking at the culture and seeing if that culture has been changed, not for the perfect, but for the good,
yeah.
um, due to the things that we've been taught. So very, very nice. I like that response.
I
Uh,
think it is through like yeah, the culture is not perfect, but it is sometimes through that culture that we can come to know God in part too. Right? One of the ways I form my understanding of who God is by seeing the good and decent, God-fearing people around me living the best life they know how. And I'm like, wow, like
Amen.
there are people in my world I can point to and say that person is teaching me what it is like to be what it is like to know God. You know, imperfections notwithstanding. So,
Excellent. All right. So the next um, reframing, I'll start with the idea of truth again. What threshold of evidence do I need before I can justifiably say that I know God exists? This reminds me, you're probably familiar with Jonathan Haidt,
yes.
and I think one of his books, he explained the impulse that we have when we're faced with uh, maybe a moral value or something that we strongly believe in. The question we tend to ask if we believe in something strongly is, can I believe this? Oh, I found one little evidence. I can believe it. Yay. And then if
Yep.
you're against something,
Hmm.
the question you ask is, do I have to believe this? And so you look for one little thing that shows that you have a way out. So
Yep.
I think this idea truth, probably 90% of LDS and XMO podcasts out there are talking about this right here.
Yes. And the truth is, like, I've known people, for example, who are like, yeah, there's no evidence that could convince me, really, because my threshold of persuasion is so high, and all the arguments are leveraging against me to persuade me of the restored gospel. I feel like that's all nonsense. And then they'll go and they'll pray, and they'll have an encounter with God, and they'll come back and say, I'm in. And it wasn't the arguments that convinced them. It was a direct encounter with God that convinced them. And the arguments that they did not find persuasive before, they are perfectly persuasive now to them. They don't even need those arguments at all. They're already in. And the point here
Right.
again is that the persuasion when it comes to spiritual matters is just not found through logical argument. It's useful to have it, and I think I'm grateful that people are putting logical arguments together, but that's not where people are going to be persuaded. They're going to be persuaded by encountering God. He's a person. They're going to be entering in a relationship with him. So, yeah.
Very good. And the person truth reframe is given God's faithfulness to us as recorded in sacred writ, how can we be faithful to him? I,
Yeah.
I, I really I like this framing, but I had one little nitpick about it.
Oh, sure.
And unfortunately, maybe I'm starting to learn a little bit too much about sacred writs issues. But sometimes, like especially like the five books of Moses and the stories in there. I mean, you read some stuff in there. Like I recently read the book of Judges, and I feel like I felt dirty afterwards. Like I just watched like a rated R plus movie. Just Jephthah sacrificing his daughter, and there's nothing in the text that said, and therefore Jephthah suffered, and he lost his. No, I think that the author either had nothing to say about this human sacrifice or that it was okay. And I'm like, what? So
Well,
I'm
yeah,
not sure everything in there is just perfectly right.
the past is a foreign country, as they say, right?
It's very
Now,
foreign.
now, what's interesting here is that like I am not in the position to say what stories in the Old Testament are true and which ones are false. I'm of the perspective that the historical record is very lossy, right? Where like when you
Hmm.
like you I actually fully expect to find out that a bunch of the stories that we read in the Old Testament are either not true as written or incomplete or distorted in time or whatever the case is, right? Um, I'm fully prepared to discover that. The what I sometimes push back on is the why, right? If, for
Okay.
example, if, for example, someone says this can't be true because God would never do that, that's where I say, well, why would he never do that? Because it violates my abstract idea of what I consider to be right and wrong.
Mm.
And I'm like, okay, so what you're saying is that you have figured out all the ins and outs of right and wrong. You've elevated that to some sort of ideology, and you're now judging God through it. Hey, I don't like that story either very much.
Yeah,
But what if you found out that God really did do that? Like,
that would be rough,
yeah, that would be rough.
honestly.
But the truth is, what do you worship? An abstract idea, or do you worship God? You know? And so I look at this and I'm like, okay, like, what if, like, yeah, I know the problems with some of the ancient writings, and I know that I don't expect to find that every story is exactly true as written, and I have no problem with people who hypothesize that some of these stories might have errors. I just want to say, can we push pause on assuming that we know which ones are true and which ones are not by virtue of looking through our own modern moral sensitivities,
Yeah,
right?
I think you're absolutely right about that. What do they call that? Like the historian's fallacy when you look back and
Yeah,
you judge people by and characters and people of the past by your modern values and say that was a terrible king.
I think C.S. Lewis called it chronological snobbery, you
Oh,
know?
I like
Yeah.
that too.
But it's this assumption that we are somehow more morally enlightened, and therefore, if it violates our moral sensitivities, it must be wrong. And I'm looking at that's not a worship of God, that's a worship of self.
I like that. So you're saying that sure the way the Old Testament and some of the scriptures come to us isn't perfect. Things can be wrong. Maybe something was ascribed to God that isn't, but the way to judge that isn't through my personal morality that I'm
Correct.
injecting into the text.
Correct. And you know what? I wouldn't even put this past God to include some of these stories that maybe they're not even true, right? I don't know, right? But to include some of them just to force us to not treat our own moral assumptions as though they were God,
Right.
right?
Cool. Yeah.
Like maybe he's trying to say, look, I want you to treat this as scripture, and I want you to move forward as though it were, just so that you won't assume you've made it all the way, that you figured it all out, you know?
Excellent.
So
I
I don't
think
know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one last point I wanted to make about person truth, and this is a positive statement rather than a questioning or a nitpicking.
Oh, of course.
Uh, yeah, given God's faithfulness, how can we be faithful to Him? And I found like just learning how to give gratitude is something that I find helps me recognize that faithfulness. And I don't want to make this podcast about me. It's about you, but that's just something that I found.
It's about you too.
Yeah, I guess I found it very helpful to frame it this way as, look for God's faithfulness and then see through that how to be faithful to him, right? If you're grateful for some God blessing God gave you, maybe you should help shower that same blessing on others if you can.
Yeah.
Your
Well, and
thoughts?
also, well, I have two things to say on this too. Like going back to your like you can nitpick the sacred writ all you want, but what is the unfolding narrative story of the scriptures? It is the story of God's faithfulness to his covenant people and their
Right.
unfaithfulness to him, really, you
Yeah.
know? But so if you look through that lens, like, okay, whatever the details, right? Like, we don't have to get into the weeds. Let's take a step back and say, what is the story? Is the story telling us that God keeps his promises? And if he keeps his promises to us, then we can trust those promises. And we should keep our promises to him. And going back to the original idea truth question here, like, you know what? I prayed about lots of things in my life, and I haven't always gotten an answer to prayer. I haven't always. Um, and when I say, "Hey, God, help me to, Heavenly Father, help me to know that this particular idea is true or false," and sometimes I don't get nothing. But when I say, "Heavenly Father, help me to know how to serve my students," I always get an answer. Help me to know how to serve my children. I always get an answer. Help me to know how to be a better minister. I always get an answer. It is in my attempts to be faithful to my
That's
covenant
awesome.
that God answers my prayers and reveals himself to me. It is not in my quest for abstract certainty. It's not in my quest for intellectual knowledge of the gospel that God answers my prayers. It's in my attempts to live out my covenants that God answers my prayers and in which I encounter him in my life. And I think that too often we treat the gospel as this intellectual endeavor where we're trying to ascertain that God is real by asking questions about him and his character and so on, right? But in reality, the way to find God is by serving him. The way I find God is by making promises to him and keeping those promises and seeking his help to do so. And suddenly God's everywhere, under every stone, under every rock and twig.
Excellent. That's beautiful. Thank you. All right, last one. Let's see. I skip. Here we go. Start with idea truth. How can prophets be divine messengers if they teach in ways that reflect the norms and assumptions of their particular culture? And the person truth. How can prophets guide us through the particulars of our social, historical, cultural, or political context? Heard some say that one way you can get at divine truth is to look at all the prophets from Adam to today and see where their teachings converge. It's like finding the common
Yes.
denominator across all of them.
And
And
where they
bingo,
diverge is therefore cultural, right?
yeah, and if it's divergent cultural, you can ignore it. And so you're kind of, it looks to me like you're pushing back on that here.
I am pushing back on that a little bit, right? So,
Mhm.
I mean, so first off, let's say here, like the assumption here is that if is cultural, is therefore not inspired, right? The truth is, I think our church would look really different if it was if it was if the earliest members weren't so Protestant, right? I think our church would look different. I think our church would look very different if the restoration happened in Africa or in Australia or in Asia. It would like just imagine a hypothetical universe where for some reason there was religious freedom in Asia, but many of the other cultural norms are the same, and some prophet saw God and revealed the restored Christianity to some prophet in Asia, and that is what sparked off the restoration of the gospel. Like the church would look very, very different,
I'm going to have
and
to
it
ask
would
you
be.
to give me some examples of some things that you think might look different just to
I
help
don't know.
make the
I don't
point.
have that good of an imagination, but you know what? Right? Like I imagine that some of our practices would be a little bit like they would
White
look more
shirts
Asian. Just like
on
right now
Sunday.
they look more Eastern. Right now they look very Protestant, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and the truth is, I think they would also be just as inspired. Um, Going back to the whole bishop thing, right? A bishop could do one thing in one context, another thing in different context, and be equally inspired in both contexts. Um, Let's
Right.
say, for example, I'm trying to figure out how to best serve my students as a teacher, and I pray and ask God to help me. And He says, email the students who aren't showing up to class. That happened once. I did it. That was an inspired action. But let's say somebody else over there asks the same question, and God says to him, let's see here, um, do more quizzing in class. Cool. That's also an inspired thing, right? But the point here again is that we tend to assume that nothing that can change or vary across context can be inspired. Um, could it be, for example, that the dress and grooming standards of the 1940s and 50s that church leaders enforced and reinforced in the church were inspired, and the slightly different dress and grooming standards today are also inspired?
Right. And even the changing of the word of wisdom over
Yeah.
time, I think, is a good example. It's contingent on being temple worthy, right? That might be the place where people say, "Hey, how come you made this change?" But I get
Well,
it. At least I can
yeah.
say that. I like looking at this from his just a cultural perspective, and maybe our needs change that God understood and we don't.
Well, I think going back to this idea versus person questions here, I would say that I think there are some who assume that the way we can recognize the divine messenger is through the content of their teaching, and if the content they're teaching lines up with what we expect to come from divine messengers, their ergo, that's how we know. But the truth is, I think that like prophets are allowed to surprise people. I think they are. And furthermore, I think that what makes them divine messengers is not the content, but the source of their message. And
Right.
like the question here is not, does this line up with what I assumed? The question is, does this come from God? Um, two people can be given the exact same assignment to speak in sacrament meeting. And one
Hmm.
person, maybe they come from some culture elsewhere in the world, might give a very different treatment on the subject that is still within the doctrinal bounds, but just a very different treatment of the subject, and still be just as inspired as some other person who gives a different treatment from their cultural background. Okay, so for example, we as a modern Western Americans, we live in very siloed homes, right? Parents and children live in this house, and then 30 feet away, there's another house, and their parents and children live there. There are cultures in the world where that's not the case, where you're living in the same house your parents lived in, and where grandparents are still living, and that's just normal and assumed, right?
Yeah,
That
that'll be normal here pretty soon, I have a feeling.
oh, I'm sure that's true, right? But
Just
but when we
yeah.
talk about, for example, strengthening our families, we can strengthen
Hmm.
our families through different cultural norms, and those different cultural norms and different cultures can both be expressions of that divine imperative. So,
Right. Yeah. A couple of other situations come to mind recently when President Nelson, uh, took his office as our president and prophet. He made some changes, or at least one in particular I'll talk about, is the use of the word Mormon. It seemed to
yeah.
have been somewhat ac- accepted and occasionally celebrated. I remember um, there's this video, we still have it. It's called Meet the Mormons.
Yes.
And then we had this I'm a Mormon campaign. And then overnight, it's, President Nelson's note, we're changing that. We're not using it at all. And I think he even said that like it was a win for Satan every time we
Mhm.
said Mormon instead of the full name of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I
And
think what I think I would push back slightly and say it's a win for
mhm,
Satan if we as a church are known by Mormon rather than by the name of Jesus Christ. I think is what
yeah.
I think was the
And you
intention.
may
Like,
be
yeah,
interpreting more correctly than I did.
yeah.
I don't have it in front of me. Um, and I guess like from me, I found this difficult, but at the same time inspired. I think it's
Mhm.
right, and at the same time, I still struggle with it. I do tend to use the word Mormon, but it's usually in context of the the Mormonism of not just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but you have like the Reformed Church that became the Community of Christ, and then you have all
Yes.
these spin-off groups, the Stringites, and to me, I would call those Mormon and not feel bad about it. But the proper name of the church, yeah, definitely, I think that was at least my personal opinion is that it's a good move. But at the same time, it was hard for a lot of us. And I would think that if you were looking back at what the previous prophet said,
Well, this
yeah,
is
it's just sudden and difficult.
well, this is interesting because like there's two angles here, right? One angle is that if you take the idea truth, right? Well, if it was right then, it should be right now, right?
Hmm.
If it was okay then, it should be okay now. But if you take person truth, then as Joseph has said, what I wish is right in one context can be wrong in another. And maybe we don't have to find some sort of moral casuistry, moral mathematics to make it all rational for us, right? We can just accept that it was okay then, it's not okay now. And we can live with that because God is a living God and not an abstraction. And we should expect that by virtue of being a living God, that he is allowed to surprise us because that is what makes people people, the fact that they're inexhaustible and have the endless capacity to surprise, you know? Um, but on the other hand, I think what a lot of people missed was that the rhetoric has actually been far more consistent than what a lot of the detractors have claimed. Like I, as the person, went back and found similar quotes from all the way
Hmm.
back into the early 1900s and throughout the entire 20th century, prophets and apostles were urging us to use the full name of the church. It was a repeated counsel that got re-emphasized by President Nelson, but it wasn't nearly as, it's actually there is this common pattern, this thread through it all. I think it was just for a while we got very lax about it, is really what it was. So,
Okay. That I guess that's one way to look at it. It does seem,
mhm.
I don't know, I guess someone can push back and say, but why? I don't know, you could always say this, but why President Nelson and not President Monson?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's always true.
And
But then
perhaps we'll never
again,
know.
why any prophet and not a devil prophet?
Yeah,
Because sometimes, for example, the sociological needs of the church can change. It could be that during the early 2000s, it was actually kind of a sociological imperative that we destigmatize the word Mormon. And then
yeah.
now it's the new sociological imperative because of the shifting sociological currents of the world that we reiterate that we're also Christian, you know? So,
No, I like that way of thinking about it. The hard part about what you're saying, though, is that that's kind of complex. That's not something John Young can figure out on his own when it's time to do those things, right?
right. But I think one thing that I hope is helpful about this perspective that I'm offering here with the idea truth and person truth is that it is the idea truth it's to try to make everything consistent all the time, right? To take our understanding of the gospel and of the church and its institution and the prophets and try to make them all fit in neat and not tidy buckets where we can figure out what is cultural, what is doctrinal. Doctrinal is true, cultural is just whatever, and so on. And and I think that what I'm offering here is that we don't actually have to understand it all to accept that the imperatives that prophets are giving the saints in 2080 are probably going to look different than the ones they're giving in 2026. And that's okay. We
That's
don't
for
need,
sure.
yeah. And so once that's accepted, once that's a given, we can say, oh, well, sure, it could be an intellectual hobby trying to make it all make sense, but that's all it needs to be is a hobby. It doesn't have my faith doesn't have to hinge on that anymore.
Right. That's a good thing to remind ourselves of is that I like that framing of being an intellectual hobby. Kind of takes the tone down from being I'm searching for truth, but I'm just thinking about things. And I
Yeah,
think God gave us our thoughts for reasons to try to figure things out. I'll just give a quick example. I like to think about how the word of wisdom, what it means, why God gave it to us. And I have a bunch of ideas, but I know none of those ideas are gospel truth or things I should necessarily be taking so seriously that I know that is why.
right.
It's my little gospel hobby.
And sure enough, going back to that itch, the itch of finding the generalizations that are always true, isn't always bad either. In fact, what
Hmm.
will be this case in 2080? What will prophets probably still be teaching the people? You know what I think? keeping the Sabbath day holy, making and keeping covenants with God, honoring thy father and mother, love God, love neighbor, minister to others, uh, keep ourselves unspotted from the world, and so on, right? Like
Right.
like there are patterns that we can rely on, and we can lean on those patterns, and that and so that much is true, and there's nothing wrong with looking for those patterns, and I think relying on them.
Excellent. Thank you. I do have one more slide that I want to talk about, and then we're almost done. All right, this is taken from a
Ooh,
picture from your book, and I really like this. And it's two graphs. The graph on the left is the idea truth, the Greek way of thinking, and you have this progression in human knowledge that has an upward slope. And
yes.
you're right, we can see this in technology and science, right? And then at some
Yeah.
point you have a revelation, right? You might have an Albert Einstein who's thinking, oh, I need to explain why gravity or the force, the acceleration due to gravity on a person is like the same as that you feel in a accelerating car, right? He can think about those things and come up with a new idea that can test and become a revelation. Then on the person truth side, you have an like a sine wave, right? Where human moral knowledge is going up and down, up and up and down. And this is the kind of thing we see in like the Book of Mormon and in the Old Testament, right? You have these righteousness cycles, and they're kind of based off of you feel enlightened, you start doing what's right, and naturally, I think when people do what's right, they're prospered.
Yes.
That can be by God coming down and intervening, but it can also be just like, hey, when people treat each other nice, they trust each other. You get things like investment and businesses are successful, but then we start to get greedy, everything goes down, and then we need revelation to bring us back on track, kind of where we were before.
Well,
So what I really liked about the
yeah.
graph on the this graph, the person truth, was that probably like almost all the time in moral knowledge, that's exactly what I'm doing. Maybe
Yeah.
there's a little bit of an upward slope over time, but I think majority of what's happening is this, hey, I need to get back on track. I'm probably, you know, that's why we go to church every week and we continually read our scriptures, even if we've read it before.
Well, I mean, consider this, right? So, like, as a scientist, like, imagine you're a scientist, you're studying physics, and as you move into quantum mechanics, it's been a while since you looked at classical physics. Do you
Hmm.
forget classical physics?
Kinda.
Well, I would say, I mean, you say kinda, but not really. I mean, just to dust off your textbook, look over the pages, okay, I got it again, right? Like, it's not,
Right.
like, the truth is, like, once you fully understand the facts of idea truth, like the facts of physics, you know what? Like, it's kind of hard to completely lose it. Right? It's kind of hard. Like it's there. Like it tends to accumulate. There you go. Accumulate. It's cumulative. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Um, and so as we accumulate knowledge, as we read more and more books about science, we get generally like we're collecting this knowledge and we're not necessarily losing old knowledge either. I mean, sure, sometimes it consolidates and sometimes you lose some like you do some neural pruning and you lose some of the details as you go along. Um, but but generally your knowledge of facts gets higher over time. But what's interesting I've found is that when I have had friends who have forsaken their covenants and left the church, they genuinely forget the truths they once knew.
Hmm.
And what I mean by this is that, yeah, they might not forget the 13th article of faith. Maybe they can still recite it, but they'll
Yeah.
forget they'll remember some of the facts, but they'll forget all of the relational components of the gospel. Um, the metaphor that I'm actually baking into the next version of this book is I said, imagine your spiritual life like a garden, right? And you're planting seeds in this garden, seeds of genuine spiritual truth. And genuine spiritual truth is living truth. And these seeds will sprout and they'll grow as living truths in your garden. But not everything you encounter in church is living truth. Your Sunday school teachers will sometimes teach false ideas. Throw them in there too. You had the chewing gum lesson, for example. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, yeah, the infamous chewing gum lesson.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Maybe
Yeah.
some Sunday school teacher will do the chewing gum lesson and they'll throw that in there. That's like planting a plastic plant in your garden. It's not living
Hmm.
truth. It has a resemblance of truth to you. Maybe you can't tell it apart, but it looks like truth, but it's plastic. It's not living, right?
Yeah, it's not going to bear any fruit you can eat.
Yeah. It's not going to bear any fruit you can eat, but it's still in your garden. And so all of our gardens, yours, mine, heck, maybe general authorities, I won't name names here, right? We all have spiritual gardens full of living truth, but also some plastic plants too. Like, but then what happens when you stop watering the garden?
You'll, yeah, I see that. You're going to
The
lose your
real,
good plants and keep the bad ones
yeah, you lose the
if they're
real plants.
plastic.
You keep the bad ones. The bad ones remain. The real ones die, wither away, and you don't even know they were there. And what happens, I see this often on, is so often is that people will abandon their covenants, leave their faith, and then 5 years later, all they remember is the chewing gum lesson. All they remember is that weird talk they
Right.
heard in church. All they remember are the doctrinal things that just weren't true. And this is one reason why I think like former members of the church so often misrepresent their faith. Is not they're not even necessarily doing it on purpose because that's what they remember as their faith. Like I have had friends who say they've left the faith and they're like, yeah, all we talked about in church was works. We never talked about grace. I'm like, no, we talked about grace all the friggin' time. You know? Like,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was taught that I had to be like perfect in order to be worthy. And I'm like, no, you weren't. Or maybe some dude did, yes, but that's all you remember, you know? And but what I think is happening is that the living truths died, but the plastic plants remain behind. And the point here again is that going back to your chart here, the one that you have on your screen, yeah, we can accumulate all this facts and knowledge, and maybe we won't lose the facts and knowledge, but what we will lose is the connection to the living vine, right? And that is where the real good stuff is. The stuff that we love about the gospel is not the facts and abstract ideas or the doctrinal abstractions. What we love about the gospel is the juice that the nourishment that we get from being connected to the true vine. And once you're
Absolutely.
disconnected, that's what you stop getting, and that's what you lose, and that's what you forget. Um, was it Alma or Amulek who was talking about how what's the verse? Um, and like if we do not give heed, then we lose the truth that we have until we know nothing concerning the mysteries of God. And I think we see that pattern a lot. And they lose that once they're
Yeah.
connected from the true vine, they no longer remember. And I think, where this connects with the core argument of the book is that the God we worship is a person with whom we have a relationship. And when we turn our backs on that relationship, when we are unfaithful to our commitments to that person, and we are no longer we no longer in regular communication with that person, we forget that person.
Thank
Like,
you. That's very powerful.
yeah, this happens with real people, right? Like
Yeah, I've
it,
seen this, like especially online with certain people who, left the church and they have, YouTube channels complaining about it. And and I don't want to be insensitive to them because I do try to empathize.
Mhm.
But you're right. I do see this, those plastic plants are the ones that they keep focusing on. And uh, you'll never see me do a response video to any of that. But it is kind of heartbreaking to see that part of the, what something in the church that wasn't the greatest is now the thing that is they're trying to define us by.
Yeah.
It's tragic.
Well, like I survived the Latter-day Saint Church, and all I got for it were these plastic plants, right? And I'm like, well, no, you got a whole lot
Yeah.
more. You just stop watering them, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but going back to like, I just want to make the connection again to people.
Hmm.
If you stop talking to your parents for years, you won't entirely forget them, but all you'll keep with you is a caricature of them, right? There's a quote I included somewhere in the book about C.S. Lewis, and he's reminiscing, he's reflecting on his experiences after the loss of his wife, Joy. And he talks about how the memory I have of her is not the real her, right? The real her would shatter my caricature that I've made in my mind every single day. But the longer
Right.
it's been since I've been with her, the more my memories of her become a caricature of her. I'm butchering the words. It's not the exact word that he used, but his point is the same. Is that without regular contact with the people that we love, our memories of them drift, and we form an idea version of them instead. Um, and so if truth is a person, we need to be in regular relationship with them, regular contact with them, so God can regularly refresh our understanding of Him. Otherwise, it will always go stale.
Thank you. And I do have one last uh, big question, and
Sure.
I think when I first looked at these two charts, my thinking was, yes, of course, the person truth one I think makes sense on a daily basis for me, but how does this person truth explain the priesthood ban? That's like the one gotcha
Ah,
that
yes.
makes me thinking like, actually, I could see how that was a bad idea. Maybe that's one of those plastic plants that got planted somehow, but it was a bad idea that we clung to, made reasons for, and then people had to question this bad idea. So it's almost
Yes.
like there was an idea truth that replaced a bad idea truth, and we had a revelation and a turn, or an increase. How would you respond to that? What I've just said. How do
Yeah.
you think the priesthood band fits in this model?
The honest answer is I don't know. I don't have any particular insight on that matter. I would say I think there's room for a lot of perspectives within the community of faith. I think that, for those who say, hey, I think this was a mistake and the prophets, who reinforced it were wrong. I think there's room for that. I also think that there's room for those who are like, we don't know. Maybe God really did do this for reasons, sociological reasons we don't know, right?
Hmm.
Um, I think that we should be careful. Again, this goes back to the humility of not assuming that our own moral assumptions are and elevating them to some level of abstraction that we then judge everything in the past by, even including the recent past. Um,
Right.
like I think racism, for example, is wrong. And I think it's probably wrong no matter where you are and where like in what age of the earth you're in. Um, that said, what my intuitions tell me that if we assume that God could never have done something like that, I wonder if we're still worshiping our own moral sensitivities more than we're worshiping the living God of Israel. And I want to be careful with that, right?
Yeah.
Right? Because I don't want I don't want to because I like I'm right now I'm kind of leaning your direction a little bit on that issue. But I have to be careful
Mhm.
because I don't have any special revelatory insight and God stands revealed or forever unknown. And what I think that means in practice is that until God tells us, we're not going to know. So,
It still remains within the bounds of my own mind and my own understanding.
yeah. And so in that sense, I think prophets and apostles today are very reluctant to say with anything one way or the other on the issue, particularly because there is a lack of direct revelation on the matter, and they don't want to speak where they don't know, where they haven't actually, heard from God on the issue. So, and I think that it would be we can have our own intellectual hobbies where we try to make it all make sense and all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
but that's all it's ever going to be for us until God reveals something. So,
What would you say to somebody who says, "Well, what if the priesthood ban comes back?" What would that say about the person truth?
you know what? I'm not even going to answer that question. My apologies
Okay,
because
good.
no, it's just because I don't have anything to say on the matter.
All
Like,
right.
but I will say this: I don't think the priesthood man's coming back. I really, really don't.
Yeah, same.
I don't
It's
think it ever
like,
will.
yeah,
But there is this presumption that many make that because we live in a ongoing restoration of the gospel, that because we believe in continuing revelation, they tend to assume that continuing revelation will always unfold in ways that match their own progressive sensibilities.
Yeah.
And
And that
what
doesn't
if,
have to be the case.
yeah, what if prophets and apostles reinforce conservative sensibilities? Is that ongoing revelation? Is that the ongoing restoration?
Could
And
be. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and like we have to be open to both. And this is where again the problems that I'm trying to articulate in this book are not on one side of the ideological spectrum or the other. It's on both. We have progressives on one side who say continuing revelation means the church is always going to be pressing the boundaries of tradition towards my own progressive view of life. And then we have conservatives on the other side who says the ongoing continuing revelation means the church is always going to press lean towards the tradition that I believe are true and so on. And we have, on the one side, conservatives have to be willing to be surprised when prophets and apostles say, when and if prophets say, hey, the progressives are right on some things. And the progressives have to be okay and willing to be surprised when prophets and apostles say, hey, you know what? Those things that you think are culturally conservative, they're actually still really good, and vice versa.
Right. Yeah.
And we have on both sides, we have to realize that it's not ideology that we worship or tradition or abstract doctrine. It is the living God of Israel, and he has chosen messengers. He has commissioned spokesmen for himself to speak for him on this earth. And those are the prophets and apostles who lead this church. And that means that if we are following God, we're going to be lending our ear to what his spokesmen have to say, his authorized messengers. And and we need to be listening to what they have to say in the here and now, not what we think they're going to say in the future, not what they've said in the past, but what they're saying in the here and now. So,
Thanks, Jeff. I will say one thing that I think has worked for me, and you know, my my wife has kind of teased me before that I seem to change my worldviews and opinions a little too often. But basically, where I'm at now, I've heard some of the brethren give talks, and I'll listen to these, and sometimes I'll be like, you know what, I just kind of feel attacked on that one. I feel like I don't really like that one. And what I've learned to do with it is to just kind of hold on to it and think about it some, and just kind of ask myself, okay, well, what's some of the good that could be done by this teaching? Also, what in my thinking might not be quite right
mhm.
that this teaching could be helping me with? And those questions don't tell me where to go. They don't tell me just accept it. But I do know that I have to give it something, and I have to give it my time and see if how it could maybe change my moral intuitions. If I
Yes,
didn't do that, I wouldn't be a good disciple.
that's the right approach. I mean, I think it absolutely is the right approach. Right?
Yeah,
For example, if I'm out there being too belligerent on cultural matters, like in defense of the Proclamation on the Family, and prophets say be peacemakers, and I'm like, whoa, maybe I should adjust my tone. And if I'm out there like being squishy on those same matters, and possible prophets say we need to defend marriage, maybe I need to adjust my tone, you know? And but
yeah,
like, but the point is always being humble enough to say, am I the problem here? If
exactly.
just because prophets aren't always like we don't have to think they're infallible. We don't think they're always right on everything they ever say, but we should be humble enough to assume that just because my sensibilities contradict doesn't mean that that's where they're wrong. So
Absolutely. Well, Jeff, thank you very much. This was a great conversation, and I'm glad you put up with my questioning.
there was
Um,
no putting up with your questioning. Your questions are great.
I do feel a little bit bad about one of them, but uh, sometimes I think we're encouraging the church to ask more questions, and sometimes those questions can be a little rough or maybe not super appropriate. But I'm glad you're willing to listen to me and give me some time. Um, Before we go, I just want to show the book again. This is Who is Truth? It's by Jeffrey L. Thayne and Edwin E. Gantt. Uh, yeah, this has been this has been a great book. I've enjoyed it so much, and so I recommend it to anyone. And I will put a link to this in the description for this video. And I don't get any money for it. I just want you to read it and enjoy it like I have. So thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Hey, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.